He gave up his bed to 2 Apache sisters, and at dawn 150 warriors arrived. The sun was setting over the dry, golden hills of the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. John sat on the worn wooden chair outside his small cabin, watching the last rays of light fade behind the distant mountains. His life had always been quiet, almost lonely. Ever since he had moved to this remote area, he had lived alone, surrounded only by the whisper of the wind and the occasional call of a bird. He liked the silence, the way it allowed him to think and reflect without interruption. The desert, harsh and unforgiving to many, had become his home and his companion. John's cabin was simple but sturdy. Built from rough-hewn logs and clay, it had one small room with a fireplace, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. There was a small kitchen corner, where he kept some cooking pots, a few utensils, and a modest supply of food that he had brought from the nearby town. Each item in the cabin had a story, but none of them compared to the story he was living, a story of solitude, hard work, and survival in a land that demanded respect. That evening, as John prepared a small meal of beans and corn bread, he heard a soft but distinct noise outside the cabin. At first he thought it was the wind, rustling through the sparse desert shrubs, but then he heard it again, footsteps, light and careful, approaching the cabin. His heart beat a little faster. Visitors were rare in these parts and strangers even rarer. He grabbed his old rifle, not with the intent to harm but to protect himself if needed. He stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against his face. There, standing a few feet from the door, were 2 young women. They looked weary and dusty from travel, their clothes simple but well kept. Their eyes were wide and cautious, glancing around as if they had seen too much and trusted too little. Despite the wariness in their gaze, there was also a quiet dignity about them. They spoke softly, their words in a language John didn't fully understand, but he could sense that they were asking for help. John hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. He had heard stories of people being tricked or attacked, and he knew the desert could make strangers desperate and dangerous. Yet, when he looked at the 2 young women, he saw fear, fatigue, and perhaps a hope that he could not ignore. Something inside him stirred, a sense of compassion and responsibility. Slowly, he lowered the rifle and stepped forward. "You can come in," he said in his calm, steady voice. "There's a fire and you can rest." The sisters exchanged a brief, grateful glance and nodded. They followed him inside, their movements careful and respectful. John gestured to the bed, the only one in the cabin. "You can sleep here," he said. "I'll manage on the floor." The sisters looked at him, surprised, and one of them whispered something in her language. John didn't understand the words, but the tone was soft and thankful. He felt a small warmth in his chest, realizing that his simple act of offering the bed had brought relief to these strangers. He rolled out his thin blanket on the floor, prepared a small pillow, and sat down near the fire to keep watch. As the sisters settled onto the bed, John noticed how tired they were. Their eyes slowly closed and their breathing evened out, the tension of the long journey finally releasing. He watched the fire crackle and pop, thinking about the path that had brought them here. He didn't know their names yet, nor why they were traveling alone through such dangerous terrain. But he knew one thing: he had made a choice to help, and that choice had already changed the night. Hours passed quietly. John listened to the desert around him, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of the wind through the rocks, the faint rustle of the sisters' movements in their sleep. His mind wandered back to the times he had lived alone in this cabin, nights filled with silence and the occasional thought of loneliness. Yet tonight, the presence of these 2 young women brought a strange comfort. The cabin, which had always been just a shelter for one, now felt alive with human connection. John thought about the stories he had heard about the Apache people in this region. Many settlers feared them, believing them to be fierce and untrusting. But he also knew that kindness often crossed boundaries that fear could not. His grandmother used to say, "A small act of goodness can change a person's world." Tonight, he was beginning to understand what that meant. By giving up his bed, by showing trust instead of fear, he was creating a bond that no words could explain. Even as he sat there, watching the fire, John felt a sense of anticipation mixed with unease. He didn't know what the future held, or why the sisters were traveling in such secrecy. But there was a lesson in this moment. Helping others sometimes came with risk, yet the reward was more than just safety. It was the chance to connect, to understand, and to share humanity in a world that often demanded isolation. As midnight approached, John finally lay down on the floor, still keeping one eye on the fire and the other on the sleeping sisters. The night was deep and quiet, yet charged with an unspoken tension, as if the desert itself was aware of the unusual meeting in this small cabin. He drifted into a light sleep, dreams mingling with the faint sounds of desert life, feeling that somehow this night was the beginning of something greater, something that would test courage, kindness, and trust in ways he could not yet imagine. By the time the first hints of dawn appeared, John had already made up his mind. He would protect these guests, no matter what. His heart was calm, his spirit steady. The desert outside might be harsh, but inside that little cabin, a new story was unfolding. A story that began with giving up a bed, but would soon grow into an adventure that neither he nor the sisters could have foreseen. The night had been quiet, but John's mind remained alert. Even though the two sisters were asleep, he could not shake the feeling that something was different about them. They moved with a cautious grace, whispered softly among themselves before sleep, and seemed to notice every small sound in the cabin. It was clear that these were not ordinary travelers, and though he did not understand their language, he sensed their awareness of danger, an instinct honed by experiences John could only imagine. He had lived alone in the desert long enough to know how quickly things could turn dangerous. Coyotes, rattlesnakes, sudden storms, or even strangers with bad intentions could appear without warning. Yet he felt no fear of the sisters themselves. Something about them radiated honesty, strength, and quiet confidence. Still, his instincts told him to remain cautious. He kept the rifle nearby, close enough to reach if needed, and sat by the dying embers of the fire, watching the shadows dance along the cabin walls. Hours passed slowly, the only sound being the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of desert animals outside. John's thoughts wandered. He remembered the stories his father had told him about travelers lost in the desert, some never returning. He also thought of the settlers' fears of the Apache people, stories that often painted them as dangerous, untouchable, or mysterious. Yet now in his small cabin, he realized how little he truly knew. These sisters were not threatening. They were human beings, tired and in need of kindness, and he had opened his door without knowing why. By midnight, the sisters stirred slightly, turning in their shared bed as if troubled by dreams. John noticed their subtle gestures, the way one gently touched the other's hand, the way they exchanged quiet glances. It struck him that they were more than sisters. They were companions, protectors for each other, united by trust and a shared journey. That realization softened John's cautious thoughts. He felt admiration and a deep sense of responsibility. He was no longer just a man giving shelter. He was a guardian, entrusted with their safety for the night. Outside, the desert seemed unusually still. The wind had dropped and the usual night sounds, the rustle of bushes, the distant howl of coyotes, were quiet, as if the earth itself waited in anticipation. John's gaze moved to the horizon, where dark hills loomed against the faint glow of the moon. His mind wandered to the possibility that more of the sisters' people could be nearby, watching and waiting. If that were true, he wondered what would happen in the morning. Would they thank him? Would they question his motives? Or would they see him as a stranger in their land? As the hours crept past, John reflected on his life in the desert. Days had become routines of solitude, gathering firewood, tending to the small garden behind the cabin, checking the traps he set for small game, and reading old books he had brought from the town. Nights were often spent alone, lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling or listening to the quiet hum of nature. Yet, for the first time in years, his solitude was shared, and that small sharing changed everything. He realized how small acts of trust and kindness could ripple beyond what anyone could predict. At around 2 in the morning, John heard a faint sound, a soft footstep, then another, very light, almost imperceptible. He froze, heart pounding, thinking perhaps one of the sisters had woken up. But no, their movements were still and steady, clearly asleep. The sound came from outside. He quietly stood, moving toward the small window, careful not to make a noise. Peering through the glass, he could see the shadows of the desert moving faintly, though it was too dark to identify anything clearly. Something about it felt different from usual desert life. His mind raced with questions. Was it an animal? Or were travelers, or perhaps even warriors, nearby? John returned to his spot by the fire, his senses heightened. He realized that this night was unlike any other he had spent alone in the desert. The sisters' presence had brought both calm and tension at the same time. There was a lesson in every movement, every whispered breath, every careful glance they shared before sleep. It was as if they were teaching him, without words, how to read the world through patience and awareness, how to notice even the smallest details, and how to respect life in all its forms. The hours passed slowly, and John's thoughts drifted to the human side of the sisters. He imagined the hardships they must have faced, walking long distances in the desert, surviving harsh weather, avoiding dangers he couldn't even name. He imagined them crossing hills, finding water, hunting for food, and relying on each other in ways strangers rarely could. His respect for them grew with every passing minute. He realized that strength often came quietly, hidden behind patience, humility, and trust. By 3 in the morning, John noticed subtle signs that the sisters were awakening from a dreamless sleep. One stretched her arms slowly, her eyes opening to the dim glow of the dying fire. The other followed, rubbing her face and sitting up. They exchanged a few soft words in their language, glancing toward John briefly with gentle eyes. There was no fear in their gaze now, only quiet confidence and appreciation. John felt a small smile tug at his lips. His simple decision to offer the bed had already built a silent bond of trust. Even though it was still dark outside, the sisters began to prepare for the day ahead. They moved with careful precision, quietly adjusting blankets, folding clothes, and gathering small belongings. John noticed the way they worked together seamlessly, each understanding the other's movements without the need for speech. It was a dance of familiarity and shared experience. He realized that their journey had taught them patience, observation, and silent communication, skills John had only admired from a distance before. As the first hints of dawn appeared, John stepped outside to check the horizon. The sky was a soft shade of pink, signaling the arrival of a new day. The desert seemed to awaken with him, the wind picking up slightly, the distant call of birds breaking the silence. He realized that in a few hours, whatever unknown forces or travelers were out there might arrive. But John no longer felt fear. The night had changed him. He understood that courage was not just about facing danger, but also about trusting humanity and extending kindness even when the outcome was uncertain. The sisters stepped outside beside him, their faces calm and observant. John offered them a small smile, feeling that their silent gratitude needed no words. In that quiet moment, standing on the edge of the desert as dawn painted the sky, John understood that this night would never leave him. It had taught him lessons in patience, vigilance, compassion, and the quiet power of trust. No matter what happened when the sun fully rose, he knew that the bonds formed in these small, shared moments were as real and enduring as the desert itself. And so the night faded into early morning. The sisters stood near the cabin, waiting for what was to come. John kept his eyes on the horizon, heart steady, knowing that soon the desert would reveal its secrets, and that his choices tonight would determine not only their safety, but also the path of his own life in ways he could not yet imagine. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the desert horizon, spilling golden hues across the hills and rocks. John stepped outside his cabin, squinting against the brightness of the morning sun. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint smell of dry earth and sagebrush. Everything looked calm, almost peaceful, but John's instincts told him that something unusual was about to unfold. The stillness felt different, heavier, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The two sisters emerged from the cabin behind him, moving with the same quiet confidence they had shown all night. They spoke softly in their language, their voices melodic and soothing to the ears, though John could not understand the words. Their eyes, however, were clear and alert, scanning the horizon as if expecting someone or something to appear. John had long since learned to read signs in the desert. The way birds flew suddenly, the rustle of distant bushes, even the subtle change of wind. Today, all of those signs pointed to an approaching presence, and then he saw them. From over the hills, moving steadily across the dusty landscape, came a long line of figures. At first, John could only make out their dark shapes against the morning light. As they drew closer, he realized that it was not a few travelers but a large group. 150 warriors, mounted on horses, their movements coordinated and purposeful. John's heart raced, and a shiver ran down his spine. The sheer number of them, combined with their silent precision, made it impossible to know what their intentions were. Instinctively, he reached for his rifle, but he hesitated. Something about the sisters' demeanor told him not to act hastily. They stepped forward slightly, speaking to the warriors in their language. John could see the warriors pause, listening carefully. Then slowly, they lowered their weapons and a few nodded. Relief and astonishment washed over John, though he remained wary. He did not yet understand the full reason for this unexpected arrival, but he sensed that the night's events, the decision to offer shelter, the act of trust, had played a role in this moment. The leader of the warriors, a tall man with a calm but commanding presence, approached John. His eyes were steady, assessing John carefully, yet there was no anger or threat in his expression. He spoke in the sisters' language, and after a moment one of them turned to John and said, "They have come to see you, not to harm you." John exhaled, lowering his rifle slowly. The tension in his body eased slightly, replaced by curiosity and cautious respect. He had grown up in a world that often taught fear of the unknown, yet here was proof that bravery and kindness could cross cultural boundaries. These warriors had come not for revenge, not for confrontation, but because the sisters had vouched for him. His small act of generosity, the simplest thing, giving up a bed, had earned their trust. The warriors dismounted carefully, their horses trained and disciplined, reflecting the same sense of purpose John had seen in the sisters. They moved in a way that was precise yet calm, almost ceremonial. John noticed their eyes, the sharpness of their focus, and the subtle way they assessed him. They were warriors, yes, but also observers, aware of every detail in their surroundings. The sisters guided them with quiet words and gestures, communicating in a language rich with respect and understanding. John took a step forward, unsure of how to address so many people at once. His mind raced. What should he say? What would be the proper way to show respect without causing offense? He remembered the lessons of patience and observation he had learned the night before. Slowly, he nodded, offering a gesture of openness and humility. The warriors, in turn, responded with measured nods, their expressions softening as they recognized his intentions. For several minutes, a quiet meeting unfolded. No words were spoken that John could understand, yet he could feel the weight of the moment. Trust was being measured, respect assessed, and a bond, fragile yet profound, was being acknowledged. The sisters moved among the warriors, translating, clarifying, and ensuring that John's role in this encounter was understood. It became clear that the knight's choices, his willingness to help, his courage to remain calm, had earned him a place of honor, however unexpected. Finally, the leader approached him directly. With a gesture that combined both formality and welcome, he extended a hand. John hesitated only briefly, then shook it firmly. In that moment, a bridge was built between worlds, between cultures that had often viewed each other with fear and suspicion. The desert, which had once seemed vast and isolating, now felt smaller, intimate, and alive with shared humanity. Over the next hour, John learned more about the sisters' people and the reason for the gathering. They spoke of recent hardships, of journeys across difficult terrain, of a community bound together by honor and loyalty. The sisters had risked much to find a safe place for the night, and John's act had demonstrated that not all outsiders were hostile. The warrior's arrival was a test, and he had passed not through strength or weapons, but through kindness and trust. John watched as the warriors interacted with the sisters, a display of respect and communication that was unfamiliar to him, yet strikingly effective. There was no shouting, no aggression, only a careful exchange of gestures, expressions, and words. Every movement seemed deliberate, every glance intentional. He realized that courage was not always loud or forceful. Sometimes it was quiet, measured, and full of integrity. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the desert, John felt a shift within himself. The fear that had gripped him in the first moments of seeing the warriors had transformed into awe and respect. He understood that his choices, small and seemingly insignificant, had created a ripple that reached far beyond his cabin. He had offered trust, and in return, he had been granted the trust of an entire group. It was a profound lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The warriors eventually prepared to leave, their horses ready, their formations intact. Before departing, they acknowledged John with nods and gestures that spoke volumes. The sisters stood by his side, quietly proud of the way events had unfolded. John felt a deep sense of gratitude toward them, realizing that their courage and wisdom had guided the entire encounter. They had placed their lives in his hands, and through mutual respect and humanity, all had emerged safe and honored. As the dust settled and the desert returned to its quiet routine, John stepped back into his cabin. He looked around at the simple furnishings, the bed he had offered, and the fire still warm from the night's vigil. Everything felt different now, charged with meaning and memory. The world outside remained vast and unpredictable, but within his small cabin, a new understanding had taken root, a belief that courage, kindness, and trust could bridge even the widest gaps. John realized that the events of this morning were more than a story of survival. They were a lesson in humanity. The two sisters, the warriors, and he had all played a part in something extraordinary. They had shown him that the desert, with all its challenges and dangers, could also be a place of connection, understanding, and honor. And though the immediate tension had passed, John knew that the memory of this dawn, of the arrival of the 150 warriors, would remain with him forever, shaping his actions and his heart in ways he could only begin to imagine. By the time the sun fully rose, painting the desert in brilliant shades of gold and amber, John had made a silent promise to himself. He would never forget this lesson. He would carry the understanding that even the smallest acts of generosity could create ripples far beyond what anyone could foresee. And as he looked toward the distant hills where the warriors had disappeared, he felt a quiet pride mixed with humility, knowing that in a world full of uncertainty, trust and kindness could stand stronger than fear. After the warriors departed, a calm yet unusual silence settled. Over the desert, the distant hills seemed emptier, the wind lighter, and even the birds quieter than usual. John stood outside his cabin, watching the dust swirl where the warriors had ridden off. Despite the relief that no danger had come to him or the sisters, his mind remained active, reflecting on the extraordinary events of the morning. For the first time in his life, he understood the power of trust, of courage guided by kindness, and the profound effects of even the smallest actions. The sisters had remained close to him throughout the encounter, moving confidently, yet always with an air of caution. They were calm now, but John could sense that the morning's tension had not fully left them. One of them stepped closer to him, her eyes bright with curiosity and gratitude, and gestured toward the horizon. John understood that she was trying to communicate something beyond words, a lesson perhaps, or an invitation to follow. Though he could not understand her language, her gestures were clear, gentle, and deliberate. As the morning sun climbed higher, the sisters began to share their world with John. Slowly, he learned about their daily life in the mountains and valleys where they had grown up. They told him about the importance of family and community, about the rituals and traditions that shaped their culture, and about the lessons they had learned from surviving in a harsh, unpredictable environment. John listened intently, realizing that these were stories of resilience, patience, and unwavering courage. Each word, each gesture, conveyed respect for the land, for each other, and for life itself. The sisters spoke of how their people traveled carefully, always observing the surroundings, understanding the patterns of animals, the flow of water, and the behavior of the wind. They described journeys across deserts and forests, teaching the young ones to move quietly, to notice the smallest details, and to trust their instincts. John realized that these skills were not just practical, they were a way of life, a philosophy of harmony with nature and human connection. The sisters' teachings fascinated him, making him reflect on his own life, spent mostly in solitude but now enriched by this unexpected encounter. Over the next several hours, John assisted the sisters in preparing a small meal outside the cabin. They worked together with a quiet rhythm, chopping vegetables, lighting a fire, and cooking simple dishes. As they moved, they explained, through gestures and a few English words, the meaning behind certain actions, why one herb was added to a stew, why the fire was positioned a certain way, or why water was poured in a careful manner. John listened and observed, learning that even ordinary tasks could hold deep significance when done with thoughtfulness and care. The conversation gradually turned toward stories of the past. The sisters spoke of hardships endured by their people, of forced moves from their ancestral lands, and of challenges faced by those who sought to protect their community. John could see the pain behind their words, yet also the strength and determination. Their stories were not only of struggle, but of hope, resilience, and survival. They spoke of the ways their ancestors had taught them to persevere, to help each other in times of need, and to never lose sight of honor and integrity. John realized that the bravery he had witnessed that morning was rooted in generations of courage and wisdom. As the day progressed, John began to share his own story. He told them about his life in the desert, about his decision to leave the town behind in search of solitude and simplicity. He spoke of the lessons he had learned from living alone, about the quiet beauty of nature, and the small moments of discovery and reflection that had shaped him. The sisters listened intently, nodding and smiling at times, their eyes reflecting understanding. Though their worlds were different, John felt a growing connection, a bridge forming between his life and theirs, built on mutual respect and shared humanity. In the afternoon, John walked with the sisters along the edge of the desert near his cabin. He noticed how they observed everything, the tracks of small animals in the sand, the patterns of the wind through the shrubs, and even the way the sunlight fell on the rocks. They explained, through gestures and careful words, how each observation could teach a lesson about survival, about being alert, and about respecting the natural world. John realized that he had lived for years in this desert, yet he had only now begun to truly notice its nuances. Their presence opened his eyes to details he had taken for granted, reminding him that learning never stops, no matter how familiar the world seems. As the evening approached, John invited the sisters to sit by the fire again. They shared simple food and quiet conversation, the kind that needed no translation, where gestures, smiles, and shared glances spoke volumes. He noticed the growing bond between them and himself, a bond of trust, of understanding, and of gratitude. The sisters had taught him that courage was not always loud or visible. Sometimes it was quiet, measured, and filled with care for others. He felt humbled and inspired by their strength and the way they carried themselves through life. The sisters also began to teach John small skills for survival, how to find water in unlikely places, how to read the signs of animals and weather, and how to remain calm under pressure. Each lesson came with a story or a demonstration, and John practiced diligently. He realized that these skills were not just practical, but also mental exercises in patience, focus, and awareness. He could feel himself growing more confident, more attuned to the world around him, and more aware of the importance of observation and preparation. As night fell, the sisters shared stories of their ancestors, stories of bravery, wisdom, and integrity that had been passed down through generations. John listened, captivated by the rich history and the values embedded in each tale. He saw the parallels between their stories and his own life. The lessons of patience, courage, and compassion were universal, transcending cultures and languages. He understood that the experiences of the sisters were not only theirs, but also a mirror of what he could aspire to in his own life. By the time the moon rose high in the desert sky, casting silver light across the sand, John felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known. He realized that the events of the day, meeting the sisters, gaining the trust of the warriors, and learning from their experiences, had changed him profoundly. He no longer saw the desert as just a place of solitude, but as a place of learning, growth, and connection. The bonds he had formed, fragile yet meaningful, would guide him in the days and years to come. The night was quiet, filled only with the sounds of the desert and the soft murmur of conversation. John looked at the sisters, sitting calmly by the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. He felt a deep sense of respect and gratitude. Their courage, wisdom, and resilience had taught him lessons that no book or solitary experience ever could. They had shown him the value of trust, patience, and quiet bravery, and in return, he had offered kindness and protection. Together, they had created a shared moment of humanity in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. As John prepared for sleep that night, laying down on the floor beside the fire, he reflected on everything he had learned. He realized that life was a series of choices, each small act of kindness or bravery rippling outward in ways that could change the course of events. That night he slept with a heart full of gratitude, knowing that the connections he had made and the lessons he had learned would remain with him forever. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, bathing the landscape in a warm, golden light. John stepped outside his cabin, breathing in the crisp, dry air. The events of the past night and day replayed in his mind. The unexpected arrival of the two sisters, the tension of the warriors' appearance, and the quiet lessons he had learned from their presence. Everything felt different now. The desert, once simply a place of solitude, had become a space of connection, growth, and understanding. The sisters were already outside, tending to a small fire for breakfast. They moved with calm precision, gathering a few herbs and preparing simple food. John watched them, a sense of admiration swelling in his chest. These young women, though tired from their long journey, radiated strength, wisdom, and patience. He realized that the courage they carried was not the loud, dramatic kind celebrated in stories of battle or conquest, but the quiet, steady courage of survival, care, and integrity. As John joined them, one of the sisters smiled gently and gestured for him to sit. They shared the simple meal in companionable silence, communicating through gestures, glances, and a few broken words in English. In those quiet moments, John felt a deep sense of peace. There was no need for elaborate conversation or grand gestures. The bond they had formed over the past day was enough. It was a connection built on trust, shared experience, and mutual respect, one that transcended language and culture. After breakfast, the sisters began to prepare for the continuation of their journey. John observed their careful packing, the way they handled each item with thoughtfulness and purpose. He could see that every action was deliberate, honed from years of practice and survival in a harsh environment. He offered to help, and together they organized their belongings, ensuring that nothing was forgotten or misplaced. John realized that these small, precise actions were not merely practical. They were lessons in mindfulness, patience, and responsibility. Before leaving, one of the sisters gestured for John to follow her a short distance from the cabin. She pointed to the horizon, where the desert stretched endlessly, and then gestured toward herself and the other sister, indicating that their journey must continue. John understood that this was a moment of farewell, though it carried more than sadness. It was also a moment of gratitude, reflection, and quiet pride. He felt honored to have shared this time with them, to have played a small role in their story, and to have been part of a moment that would shape all of their lives. The sisters spoke a few words in their language, and though John could not understand them, the tone was clear: kindness, thanks, and a sense of mutual respect. One of them touched his arm briefly, a gesture of friendship and trust that conveyed more than words ever could. John nodded, understanding the meaning perfectly. He had learned that actions often spoke louder than words, and that trust and compassion could create bonds that outlasted time and distance. As they rode off toward the hills, John stood watching, feeling a mixture of pride, gratitude, and reflection. The desert seemed to stretch endlessly before him, yet he no longer felt alone in it. The experiences of the past days, the decision to offer a bed, the arrival of the warriors, the shared lessons of survival and courage, had changed him deeply. He had learned that the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating trust and connection even in the most unexpected circumstances. Returning to his cabin, John reflected on everything he had witnessed and learned. The two sisters had shown him that bravery was not always about confrontation or strength. It was about wisdom, patience, and the ability to act with care and integrity. Their actions had influenced not only the warriors who appeared at dawn but also himself, teaching him lessons about empathy, vigilance, and the value of human connection. He realized that these lessons would guide him for the rest of his life, shaping the way he approached others, the way he faced challenges, and the way he understood the world around him. As the day progressed, John began to take care of his cabin and surroundings with renewed purpose. He repaired a section of the roof that had been damaged by wind, tended to his small garden, and checked his traps for small game. Yet in everything he did, he carried the lessons of the sisters with him, the patience, the care, and the mindfulness that had guided them in their journey. Even mundane tasks now held meaning, each action a reminder that life was shaped not only by survival, but by the way one treated others and approached challenges. Later that afternoon, John ventured toward a nearby hill to survey the landscape. From this vantage point, he could see the tracks left by the sisters and the warriors, winding across the desert sand. He traced their path with his eyes, feeling a profound connection to the events that had unfolded. Each footprint, each stir of dust, represented a choice, a story, and a lesson. John realized that life, like the desert, was made up of small moments and decisions, each with the power to shape the future in ways one could not always predict. As evening approached, John sat outside his cabin once more, watching the sun dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the desert. He thought about the sisters, the warriors, and the bonds formed in those brief but powerful moments. He understood that the story of that night, the decision to offer a bed, the arrival of the warriors, and the shared lessons of courage and trust, would remain with him forever. It was a story of humanity, connection, and the profound impact of kindness. That night, John lit a small fire outside his cabin and sat quietly, reflecting on the events of the past days. He realized that while the desert could be harsh and unforgiving, it could also teach profound lessons. It was a place of growth, of reflection, and of understanding. Through his interactions with the sisters, he had learned to see the world through new eyes, to value patience, to trust in others, and to recognize the strength that comes from compassion and integrity. John also understood that life was unpredictable. The desert, with its vastness and beauty, mirrored the journey of human existence, full of challenges, uncertainties, and moments of connection that could shape one's path forever. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for having been part of something extraordinary, for having shared trust and courage with others, and for having learned lessons that could never be taught in a book or classroom. As he prepared for sleep, laying down on the floor near the fire, John reflected on how far he had come in just a short time. From a solitary life of routine and reflection, he had been drawn into a story of bravery, trust, and connection that transcended differences in culture, language, and experience. The night he had offered his bed to the two sisters had grown into an adventure that tested his courage, shaped his character, and deepened his understanding of humanity. Before closing his eyes, John made a silent promise to himself, to live with greater compassion, to act with integrity, and to remember that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways beyond imagining. He knew that his life in the desert would continue, quiet and solitary as before, but forever enriched by the lessons of trust, courage, and empathy he had learned. He understood that the bonds he had formed, the trust he had earned, and the wisdom he had gained would guide him in all future decisions. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, John fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, quiet and serene, filled with possibilities and lessons yet to be discovered. The memory of the sisters, the warriors, and the events of the past days would remain with him, a constant reminder that life was shaped by the choices one made, the kindness one showed, and the courage one carried in the face of uncertainty. The story of that night, the dawn, and the shared journey of trust and bravery would become a part of John forever. And though the desert remained vast and untamed, it now felt less lonely, filled with meaning, connection, and the knowledge that even the smallest acts of humanity could leave a lasting impact on the world.